So hi, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Cynthia Peters. I work at World Education, and I'm the editor of The Change Agent. I'm so happy to be here today with you all to share some information and some perspective on implicit bias and racial equity in our field. I have with me Megan Morris on tech support. Thank you so much, Megan. I also benefited from feedback from a lot of my colleagues at World Education, but particularly Andy Nash and Ebony Van Dross. And I also want to thank Celia Kallenbach, who is the Vice President of World Education's US Division. She invited me to do this series of webinars, and she's going to be helping me monitor the chat today. I have a number of different times during the course of the webinar where I'm going to invite you to use the chat, so I hope you will. There might be quite a lot of us here today, but I really want to hear your voices, and I think that other people really benefit from your participation in the chat. So please be ready to type into the chat. Actually, I'm going to start that by asking you to share the name of somebody who has inspired you in terms of education. I felt like it was really important as we, in our historical moment, take on this question of racial inequity in our field, that we notice that we're part of a 400-year-long history of people who have struggled mightily to address racial inequity in education. And I wanted to lift up the name of Septima Clark, who you can see here in this picture at a literacy school in South Carolina in the 1950s. And I wonder if you could just in the chat, just add your name. You know, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and also we're standing shoulder to shoulder with many giants in our field and just people in our communities who inspire us to keep doing the work that we're doing and to take on the hard challenges that are before us. So I'm going to look at the chat and see if people are adding some names. We need to call in. We need to call in our people, our ancestors. Thank you so much, everybody. I see lots of names here. Give a scroll through the chat. I love it that it's personal. Sometimes it's your teacher, somebody close to you in your private life, and sometimes it's a historical figure. Good work, everybody. Grandmother, yes. It's just important to notice because I think when we take on the hard work, we want to pull around us the people who have come before us and the people that we're standing with now. All right. A reminder that this is just the first of 3 webinars. The next 2 are over the next 2 Tuesdays. One is April 20th, and I'm co-presenting with Reva Pearson, just a wonderful ESOL teacher. And April 27th, I'm co-presenting with Carmen Stewart. And in these, we're going to look more deeply at the classroom materials and practices. And with Carmen Stewart, we're gonna look at programs and the field and how we can address racial equity. And if any of you have heard Carmen present, she's just a wonderful presenter and a brilliant mind. And so I really hope to see all of you back for these next 2 webinars. And I want to make just set the stage here. You know, we're addressing racial equity, but we have a short amount of time to do it. It's a huge topic. Just the question of race overall and ethnicity in general in this country has many different aspects to it. It's very nuanced, and we can't do it justice. So we're going to do the best we can in the time that we have. But as a way to sort of add to our forum and to get your voices into the mix, we've created an interactive space where you can contribute your strategies that you've been trying or comment on the strategies that we're suggesting. And this is just basically a simple Google Doc, and anybody who has the link can suggest into this Google Doc. And I'm going to share that link with you at the end of the webinar. But just so you know that we've created this interactive space so we can just keep growing our thinking in this area. Okay, here's our agenda for today. We're going to look at implicit bias, define it, talk about how real it is and why it matters. And then I have 3 buckets for ways that we can address it, including raising our own awareness, putting up guardrails around us, and changing the water we swim in. And then I want to close by sharing some resources, some handouts, and some final words of inspiration. And all along the way, I'm going to be pointing to work that's being done in our field to address this. I don't want to even hint that there's some idea that, no, people aren't already doing this work. People are already doing this work in our field and in our communities. And so I want to kind of keep bringing that in as we go. So you'll see that as we go. So let's start by just looking at a definition of implicit bias. What is it? So it includes attitudes and beliefs about other people, ideas, issues, or institutions that occur outside of our conscious awareness and control. And they affect our opinions and our behavior. And everybody has implicit biases. And we can do stuff about it. There's lots we can do to combat these kind of unconscious drives that we have. And so that's what we're going to be looking at here today. And I have a video to share, which I love the title of it, Want to Catch Your Brain Making a Mistake. And it helps us understand a little bit about how implicit bias might be.
Want to catch your brain making a mistake in real time? Take a look at this checkerboard, created by vision scientist Edward Adelson. The squares labeled A and B are exactly the same shade of gray. Don't believe me? I don't blame you, I see them as different too. But here's the proof. Simply connect the two with this gray bar, and voila. Suddenly it's obvious. A and B are identical. Here's the strange thing. Remove the bar, and the illusion comes back immediately, just as strong as it was before. We can do this again for the skeptics. Different shades of gray, same shades of gray. Different, same. Our eyes can see that A and B are identical, but our brains fall for it every time, no matter how often you debunk the illusion. Why? Professor Adelson points to two specific details. First, contrast. A looks darker because it's surrounded by lighter colored squares. The opposite is true for B. Second, take a look at the soft edges of this darker section. Our brains see this and think, it's a shadow. We know that objects in shadows look darker than they actually are. So our brains compensate for that by making us actually see B as lighter. Something else to consider. We all know what a checkerboard pattern looks like. So we come into this illusion already expecting A and B to be different. And that could influence what we see. What about expectations we have about people? Which face is darker, the one on the left or the one on the right? Psychologists Daniel Levin and Mahzarin Banaji found that most people, including Mahzarin herself, see the black face as darker than the white face, even though the two faces are the exact same shade of gray. Again, debunking the illusion is simple. Here's an idea from Dan.
Just cover up the lower parts of the faces. You'll be left with two foreheads and they'll look exactly the same.
The features of the face matter. But in a second study, the researchers showed that you could create this illusion using the same face. People saw a racially ambiguous face labeled black as darker than the same face labeled white. Did you? Think about what this means. We see two faces. They are identical. But we're so used to associating different races with different skin tones that we misperceive a simple physical reality, all because of a single word. That's how powerful our expectations are. Now, when it comes to judging the brightness of objects, the errors seem pretty harmless. But research shows that we also see the exact same action as being less bad if the perpetrator is attractive. We rate the same musician as more masterful if she's described as a natural rather than a hard worker. These illusions are more costly. So what are things we can do to base our decisions in fact rather than fiction? Think back to how we debunked illusions before. We needed to have the two tiles, the two faces, in front of us at the same time to really prove the truth. So when you have multiple options in front of you, whether it's job candidates or health insurance plans, consider them side by side. Not only does this let you test your intuitions, research shows that you'll be more likely to. When people evaluate things together, they're more likely to use the same specific benchmarks to compare them. Want something stronger? If you want to avoid illusions altogether, try blinding. We've talked about this technique before, when orchestras put a curtain between musicians and judges during auditions and let the music do the talking. A new crop of players rose to the top. Sometimes we perceive more than what meets the eye, but a few tweaks to the process can help outsmart your mind.
Yeah, so I wonder if anybody has a thought that they would like to share in the chat about that. And I wonder if you see my fascinating, says Elka. And yes, I think the link, maybe Megan you could pop that link into the chat. You can also, yeah, you might be able to Google it, but yeah, so I thought it was really interesting that when they started putting a curtain down between the performers who are auditioning for an orchestra, that they got a whole new crop, she called it, of performers, because the bias you could only hear the music, you couldn't allow your brain to be biased by the person that you were seeing. So, and the checkerboard, isn't that so fascinating? It just shows you how your brain is primed to think of things a certain way. And so you do. And it's not that we can't adjust, as she says, there's things we can do to compensate for that, but we have to acknowledge first that our brain is doing that, and we're not necessarily being objective. All right, thank you so much for watching that video, and perhaps that's something you would want to share with your colleagues or with your students. There's lots of evidence out there in the world that implicit bias exists. So if you're still feeling dubious, you should try Googling the Harvard implicit bias test, and you should try taking some of those. There's lots of them where you can test your bias around Indigenous people, around African-American people, around all different kinds of biases that exist. So it's a really interesting source of data and a really interesting way to check yourself. And I can guarantee you that it's probably going to show some level of bias. And also, there's another set of data that I like to tell people about. This has to do with referees making calls during basketball games. And the reason why we have a lot of data about how they make their calls is because there's there's a large room, I think it's in New Jersey, and with a lot of monitors up, and other referees are watching the NBA games, and they're looking at the refs' calls from all different angles, and they can basically make a more objective judgment about whether the ref made the call correctly. So we can actually get data about refs' biases. And this data shows that refs are consistently biased. They tend to favor the home team, and they tend to call more fouls incorrectly on the Black players. So I'm not, it's not that I'm that interested in the NBA, but I'm interested that this data exists there. And we're going to come back to these referees in a later slide. So more on that. But before we do that, I wondered if you all would like to share a time when you perhaps have been a witness to an instance of somebody expressing implicit bias. Maybe you've been the recipient of that bias, or maybe you've expressed it yourself. And this is not something to be embarrassed about or ashamed about if you have, because one point I really hope to make here today is that we all do it. And we want to not feel shame, because shame doesn't help us actually correct ourselves. It probably more than anything just shuts us down. So if anybody wants to share a story or a time that they have witnessed or experienced or expressed implicit bias, I would love to see it in the chat. So I'm checking now. Yeah, older teachers might be expected to know less about computers. Yeah, you just make that snap judgment. There's always been a difference in how teachers react to my sister and I. We're mixed race, and she looks more Black than me. Wow, Elizabeth, thank you for that. That's really good to hear, not good to hear. I see a lot coming up. Stacy says, being a participant in a small, well, I can't quite get it before it disappears. So I know Celia's here helping me out with the chat. So, and this is going to be a lot. So I hope that everybody can, you know, check the chat and get these stories, but we can see there's no lack of stories. I really appreciate everybody sharing. I want to do this because I think it's just really important to know that we're all in this mix together. So Stacy says, being a participant in a small presentation and the presenter only interacted with me when he talked about services for single mothers and people without high school or college credentials. Wow. Yeah. These things are happening. And, you know, we sometimes think of these implicit biases as showing themselves in micro ways, but that's a macro way. People, Susan says, people assume that a spouse is the opposite sex. Yeah. Okay. There's so many more chats and I don't have time to read them all, but this is a rich source of reminder that, you know, this is real. And it really shows up in our field, of course, you know, because as teachers, there's just countless times during a day when you're teaching that you talk to people a certain way, or you ask them for evidence, or you don't ask them for evidence, or you are friendlier to something that they say, or give more time to some sets of ideas than other times. So there's just so many moments in a day when our implicit bias might be showing. Where does it come from? Well, it just comes from the water we swim in, honestly. It's our family, it's the culture, it's the media, constant messaging from all these places about race. And of course, many other things too, but we're focusing on race here. Definitely our schooling. Look at this picture, which shows the white children as happy and proud and the children of color as sad or angry. Now, was this a person, this could have been an explicitly racist person who made this graphic, but probably this was an implicit bias coming out. And it didn't just come out on the part of the creator of this page. It also got by all the editors. It got by the copy editors, the substantive editors. It got by the publisher. I mean, nobody noticed that this was sneaking through. And this is the kind of messaging that we're just immersed in all day, every day. And so it's no wonder it comes out. It applies to all of us. As I've been saying, we're hardwired to make snap decisions. We live in a society that's systemically racist. And so these messages are going into our heads and they're going to be coming back out in some kinds of ways. Does it really matter? Does implicit bias matter? Yes, it really does matter. It makes a huge difference. Metro areas with greater average implicit bias have larger racial disparities in police shootings. So people die from bias. Counties with greater average implicit bias have larger racial disparities in infant health problems. Okay, so the statistics go on and on to show that disparities matter. Non-Black teachers of Black students have significantly lower expectations than do Black teachers. So it makes a big difference in education. We treat people differently. Teachers, when I say we, I often find I'm slipping into thinking of we as white, as I am white. But so keep that in mind. Obviously, there is no royal we. We're a very different, diverse crowd here today. Names that sound white and male get more responses when people submit their resumes. And so they get more callbacks. And so there's a lot of privilege that comes with having a name that sounds white and male. And that's people's implicit bias showing itself. Perhaps, you know, even more damaging perhaps is this idea of stereotype threat. And that is that even if you're not directly facing somebody who's biased, the fear of being stereotyped, the fear of being treated in a biased way actually causes you to do less well in tests, for example. And so as teachers, if we get to the point where we might even think to ourselves, well, I'm a white teacher, but I've worked really hard on my racism. I've worked really hard on my personal behaviors, and I've really mastered my implicit biases, and I don't treat people differently based on race. Guess what? If you're white, it doesn't matter. A Black student coming into your class might have this stereotype threat. Just seeing that you're a white person might affect them in that way, that they think, uh-oh, now I'm going to have to deal with this person's bias. So, no matter what we do about our individual behaviors, there's a lot more we need to do about the larger environment, the systems that we function in, the structures that we function in, what I call the water we swim in. So that brings me to these three buckets. These are the ways that I've kind of thought about how to separate out the different ways we can combat our biases. So one of them is raising our awareness and changing our own attitudes, working on ourselves. A second one is putting in structures, what I call guardrails, to slow down our practice, so that we have a way to check ourselves, okay? And not depending on our own private abilities and our own private stamina, but having something structured. And finally, changing the water we swim in. Because if we don't change the source of all these messages, the racist messages, then we're going to keep being bombarded by those, and it's going to keep reinforcing our biases. So we have to change the water we swim in. So remember the referees, and I said I was going to come back to them. The good news is that when the referees were made aware of their biases, they actually could change their behavior. So this academic study was published in 2007, and at first it didn't get any media attention, and the biases on the part of the referees really didn't change. But then for some reason, the media picked it up, and there was a lot of stories about it, and guess what? According to the study, the bias disappeared as long as it was in this heightened place of awareness, and everybody was talking about it and thinking about it. The referees check themselves in a different way. So it's kind of positive. Like, it shows us that if we're pushing this and putting it at the top of our awareness, we really can make a change. And what does that look like for us as teachers? Well, we can build our own self-awareness. We can take those implicit bias tests just to see. We can make a conscious effort to slow down. And most importantly, I think, is we have to remember that it's not about whether we're a good person or not. It really is hard to think when you just feel kind of cornered and blamed and that it's your fault. It's really not any of our faults. We're born into this culture, but it is our responsibility to do something about it. And it's our responsibility to, get help and to bring people around us so that we don't feel alone with this challenge. So I've been saying a lot here, and I want to shift to the next bucket, which is about building guardrails. But before I do that, I want to just ask you all, how does this metaphor resonate for you? And what do you already do in your life to try to slow yourself down, to come up with strategies that will check you or hold you accountable, or maybe make you think twice, or make you look more carefully? What do you have in your life right now that you already do that's sort of like a guardrail? Maybe it's a friend that you trust and somebody that you can check in with. Maybe you're developing curriculum and you have somebody that you can share it with. So, gosh, I see a lot of good questions in here, including somebody asking about the difference between systemic racism and implicit bias. The reason why I'm talking about systemic racism is because systemic racism is the source of a lot of the messages that then give us the implicit bias. So they are different things, but they're mutually reinforcing of each other. So that's why I'm including both. So Kristen says her kids keep her aware. That's good. Keep your kids nearby. And then Sally says, I have a small voice that says, oh, you're doing that again. Good. Good to notice, gently notice. Somebody that says Tai Chi. Yeah, that's a slowing down practice. Try to mainly listen, says Valerie. That's really important, not leaping in with our opinion, but just listening. Journaling, reading about different strategies. Wait, Victoria says, wait, why am I talking? That's a great, I like that one. Why am I talking? Do I need to say this? Ask, not tell. Great. This is great. There's lots of great suggestions in here. Thank you, everybody. So yeah, building guardrails. This is what the main strategy is for changing your personal behavior. But when you set up these guardrails, it might help to do them with other people, especially if you're working in an adult ed program where you can work with others to kind of institutionalize these guardrails. So you can monitor your teaching practice. You can look at your materials and ask yourself, are they reinforcing or interrupting bias? You could consider your own perspective and how it shows up in your teaching. You could invite feedback. So you could collaborate with peers to create an observation protocol, right? Maybe you could have a teacher come in and watch you teach and get feedback from her or him. You could get student feedback through student evaluations, which is always very eye-opening. Honestly, it's hard at first. Sometimes what I've noticed when I ask students for feedback is they often at first, they just say, oh, it was great. Everything was good. Oh, I loved it, but we have to develop enough trust with our students where they can say, actually, give you some constructive feedback. And there might be something that would work better for them. And we want to be able to embrace that and help them feel comfortable saying it. We can look at our lessons and we can actually teach lessons that study the phenomenon of bias. And that might help our students start becoming aware of their bias. Build listening skills, both for ourselves and between our students. And also develop lessons that surface underlying perspective. What is the point of view going on here? What is this person's perspective? How might it be altering or shaping how they're presenting this information? That's a really complex challenge and a really important practice, I think, in the classroom. So why do you think it matters to notice how perspective shows up in our materials? I'd love to hear from you in the chat. And I also, of course, have my own thoughts about that. Why should we notice perspective? Materials are the shells and flotsam and jetsam in the water where we swim. Yes, that's great. That's very visual, Janet. Thank you. I see Celia saying that learning how to give constructive feedback is a skill in itself. It's actually an important job and career skill and academic skill, being able to hear back from somebody how they think you're doing, because you can learn from that, you can improve. That's really important for our students to learn how to give us feedback. Let's see. Because education is a byproduct of trust and being and feeling safe, says Mark. Yes. Materials carry authority and can reinforce negative stereotypes or break them down, says Amy. Yes, good point. Yeah, when the published article has a lot of authority to it. It's like, oh, this is published, it must be true. This is in my textbook, it must be true. No, not. That textbook likely includes biased perspective, and being able to ferret that out is such an important skill. Yes. Xavier says textbook publishers bring their own biases. This is especially impactful on a standardized test. So yes, analyzing our tests for racial bias is a really important strategy as well. Andy says to challenge the normalization of one white middle class perspective. Exactly. And it's so normalized that we don't even see it or notice it. It just looks like the oxygen, it's the air we're breathing, it's not even noticeable, but putting a name to it is an important part of being able to see how it functions. Yes, Carrie says, are they trying to sell you an idea? This is great, everybody. Thank you so much. I feel like there's lots of good ideas here about about how to name the underlying perspective. And so just since we're on that topic, I thought it would be interesting to share this activity, which I learned from Surge, that's showing up for racial justice. And this is, we have two opinions here, and they look like different opinions, and they are slightly different opinions, but they share an underlying perspective. Let's read them. Opinion one says, immigrants take our jobs and lower our wages. And opinion two says, immigrants are good for our economy and do the jobs that nobody else wants to do. And our food would be unaffordable if it weren't for immigrant labor. So what is the underlying perspective that these two opinions have in common? Does anybody want to hazard a guess? I mean, and there's probably a number of different answers that it could be. Yeah, all immigrants have low wage jobs. Brenda says, immigrants are only valued for the labor they can perform. Yeah. Immigrants threaten our society, says Ding Ding Gia. Yes. They threaten our society, but then the other opinion is they might help get us cheap food. So, oh, Linda's noticing that my inflection changed and got higher when I read opinion two, like it was more positive. Wow, thank you, Linda. Because maybe I agree more with opinion two than I do with opinion one. And I communicated that in my inflection. Wow, I love this. Opinion two sees immigrants in a utilitarian way, not valuing their inherent human worth. Yeah, I think that kind of goes to the main point for me, that the underlying perspective here is that both of these opinions see immigrants as valuable depending on what they do or don't do for our economy. And that's a kind of an interesting thing to uncover, right? We're talking about wonderful, complex human beings who are in our country, who have so much to offer, and we have so much to learn from, and so many ways to be in community with. And yet the spectrum of opinion about immigrants looks something like this. So it's sort of discounting them as human beings in our community. And so by unpacking these opinions, unpacking the way that they look like different opinions, and in fact, they share a similar underlying perspective, is a great exercise. I have a guardrail here for us for that kind of perspective, and that is to just center the voices of immigrants themselves, and to do that by finding immigrant voices. So I'm going to feature some items from the Change Agent here. This is from our immigration issue, a beautiful story about a woman talking about what it was like for her to leave her son and daughter behind. And I believe that we shouldn't only look to immigrant voices to talk about immigration, but we should look to immigrants to talk about anything that has to do with human beings or being in human community. These excerpts are from our mental health issue, which just came out this spring. And it's immigrants. I just picked out some of the pieces by immigrants, talking about how they are learning about and coping with and healing from mental health challenges. So we don't want to only look to immigrant voices to talk about immigration. We want to look to those voices to talk about anything, because that is what deeply humanizes them. And also we can look to other typically marginalized voices to talk about immigration. This is another piece from the immigration issue. It's by a gentleman from North Carolina, I believe. And it's just a wonderful story. He does talk about immigrants as good, hardworking people who do hard jobs and bring a lot of good to the community. But he also says things like, they're good neighbors and they're interesting. And I think he also goes on to say, they brought cricket and soccer to my community and I go to church with them, so it's just a fuller portrait, and it's written by an adult learner, and it's lifting up a voice that we don't typically hear. to talk about immigrants. And so as a teacher, bringing these materials in, it's not your voice that's disrupting the potentially narrow perspective, it's other voices of, most affected communities and typically marginalized communities. And those voices, you're centering those voices for people to grapple with and to just have in the mix. I mean, it doesn't even have to be the main topic that you're doing that. It could just be that if you're consistently bringing those voices in, you're interrupting bias. So there are some things that teachers can do to build guardrails. What about in programs? Now, keep in mind, when Carmen Stewart and I present on the 27th, we're going to be talking a lot more about programs. And when Riva and I present on the 20th, we're going to be talking a lot more about classroom materials. So there's still lots more to come on that front. But here's some ideas just for programs to think about. So could the program do more to support teachers and administrators and staff to pause? So that might mean, building in paid time for people to be able to reflect on what they're doing. Could you build in anti-bias to be part of your lesson plan template? Same as you check yourself to see if you're addressing standards in your lesson plan. Same as you ask yourself, do I have the materials I need? And have I given this enough time? You could also ask yourself, hey, is there anything in this lesson that's going to help contribute to anti-bias? And it might not every time, same as you don't address every standard every time, but if it's there on your lesson plan template, it will remind you to be thinking about that. So of course, providing classroom materials that support an anti-bias perspective, and integrating addressing bias into teacher evaluation rubrics, perhaps, and into PD, giving paid time to teachers to make this part of their professional development, possibly even making it a requirement of professional development, and maybe even evaluating teachers, based on having that be part of the rubric, how much are they really addressing bias? And importantly, this last bullet, building student leadership in your program and the wider world. So I think elevating student voice, giving students a voice in your program is a really important guardrail, because it's the students themselves saying what they need. It's positive for students in any case to be in leadership roles, because they get to grow that way. They get to use their voice, find their voice, feel their power, notice that they are an agent in their life and in their classroom and in their program. But it's also good for us, for the teachers, for the program administrators, because we need their voices to shape what the program looks like. So I'm going to take this one example from the field. There are many. I cannot possibly do it justice. But this is the El Rio Learning Center at Pima Community College in Tucson, Arizona. They're just a fabulous example of starting small. They just started with a student council, and they started inviting student voice and student leadership. And it grew from there to a statewide effort where they, over a number of years, over more than a decade, won level funding and then increased funding for adult education in their state at a time when it was under severe attack. So it was incredibly empowering and powerful for students to play this role. And they developed something called a student ambassador program, where these student ambassadors were trained to go speak to their state legislators. And now this program has been scaled nationally, and it's part of COABE every year. And they're leading a student leadership strand at COABE. And the important thing here is that, as Laura Porfirio from the El Rio Learning Center says, it's not just student-centered, but student-driven. So I want to pause here just to see if other people want to share an example of student leadership, or maybe what you do in your program to invite student voice and to strengthen student voice. So take a minute and let me know in the chat And I see that there's 24 chats that have happened since I last looked. So Celia is helping me monitor the chat. Celia, help me out if there's something that I should, I'm sure I wish I could just have the time to pause and read over everything, but that's just not going to be possible. I can't wait. When this is over, I'll be able to go back and read everything. Yes. So I really do want to impress this strategy on us, because it also is a segue to our next strategy, which is changing the water we swim in. By inviting student leadership and structuring it into our programs, often what people do is we use that to fight for increased adult ed funding, and that's really important. That's great. That's really needed. But it also does start to do this larger piece, which is change the water we swim in, meaning address some of the other systems of oppression and racism that we face. Because these folks who start to learn and get the experience and develop the muscle of, oh, I can join with others and bring about change, they're going to start doing that in all sorts of different ways. And that's been some of the lessons from student leadership in our field. Okay. All right, so let's go to address a little bit this next part. I have a warning here that this part might be harder. So why is that? I noticed that in myself, it's easier to take on things that seem winnable, and why take on something that seems like it's a big brick wall and we're never going to be able to dismantle it. But in fact, I want to remind us that in history, we've seen over and over again that we can make change. We can make really big change. We can take problems that seem intractable, and we can join with other people and we can change what they're like. And this happens through modest reform and then more dramatic reform. And it happens through lots of people working really hard. So even though the stuff we're about to look at now is going to be a little bit harder to look at and feel more daunting, I want to encourage us to kind of not flinch and not turn away, because this being able to understand the reality that we're in is a huge part of being able to address bias. So what we're going to do is we're going to zoom out and we're going to look at what's happening in our country with jobs and wages. And this is just one part of the water we swim in. This is certainly not all of it by any stretch, but I felt like I had to pick one thing and focus on it. And I picked something that I think is really relevant to adult education, to our learners, because many of them come to us looking to get a better job and make more money. And they're hoping that with more education, they'll be able to achieve those goals. And we want to support them to achieve those goals. But let's do that with our eyes wide open and looking at what is out there. So before we dive into some data that I'm going to share with you, I just want to ask you what you notice about racial stratification at work. And how might racial stratification in work contribute to the creation of bias? So I will look at the chat, and I notice that Celia doesn't have speaking rights, so she can't chime in. So maybe Megan, you could give Celia speaking rights, and that would allow her to help us keep track of the chat. So something like 95% says Rachel of farm workers are Latinx. Something like 95% of farm managers are white. Wow, thank you for sharing that statistic. And then what does that do to our, say we're flooded with this image that farm workers are Latinx and their managers are white. how does that go into us as and then come back out as implicit bias? What would be the way that that might happen? The gray box is blocking the right part. Yeah, that's because when I have the chat open, it blocks. So I'll make it a little smaller so you can see more of the screen. Sorry about that. I just need to have the chat open a little bit. I'll try to make it smaller. Yes, and then Pesha is saying that it was incredibly striking to me this spring, our students are nearly all essential workers and had to work in person as compared to people from other parts of my life who are primarily working remotely. Yes, the data shows that very clearly that there is a racial gap between who can telecommute and who has to show up for work. It's much more dangerous to show up for work during a pandemic. So that is a racial disparity that has huge health effects. It's also true that many of these essential workers who have had to show up for work are making a lot less money than the telecommuters. So it's a double whammy. And then when we're constantly absorbing messages that show Black and brown people doing these hard daily labor jobs where you have to show up and bend over and pick vegetables all day, and it's white people who are managing them, that's going to start to creep into your consciousness as just a kind of a societal norm. And that's just the way it's meant to be. And you can try to combat that, but all the people around you are getting that message too. And so even if you individually combat that message, a lot of the people around you are not combating that message. And so that's affecting our society. It's getting normalized that brown people do this work and white people do that work, and that's okay. That's kind of like a fact of life. It's part of nature. It's just what it is, and there's nothing we can do about it. So I see lots of great comments in the chat. Yeah. I hope people are taking a chance to kind of scan through them. And Megan, if you want to unmute Celia, then she could possibly help us out here too. So yeah, thanks everybody. I know we have quite a lot of people here today, almost 200. And so there's just lots going on. I really appreciate the richness of your ideas here.
Hi, this is Celia. Just to chime in, the great comments all along, but there's one comment that I want to lift out that has to do, that this points to, is the lack of diversity in our field in general.
Right.
That's an area that we also need to address. And there is some work being done in that area nationally, conversations being convened, but that's a whole other effort.
Mm-hmm. And so Leah Havas is saying that she's not seeing the chats. Some people, oh, you know what? I realize some people are only chatting to all panelists. Wow, thank you so much, Leah, for saying that. I realize that you know, you need to make sure that you post your chat to all panelists and attendees. So if you post to all panelists, it's only going to me and Megan, I think. So thank you so much, Leah, for raising that. Mm-hmm. That's a very good, you know, really noticing what's going on and paying attention there. Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do now is look at some statistics about work. And so I'm going to walk us through this. It's going to be a lot of information. I'm going to try to go slow enough that you can take it in, but you know, I'm not going to linger so long that we really dive into it super deeply. The point is to kind of paint a broad strokes picture of what work looks like in our society right now. So let's start by looking at this. I'll close my chat so it doesn't cover up any of those numbers. Let's look at this chart. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They do this 10-year projection where they look at the fastest growing occupations. And one thing I think is interesting about this is that in adult ed, we often refer to this kind of information of the fastest growing jobs are often the ones that require more credentials. They might require degrees or some other kind of credential. And they pay decently. You can see at least the top 5 pay pretty decently. The last one, home health aides, which is growing by 35%, is probably, would not really be considered a living wage, I would think. But the ones at the top 5, require some credential and they pay a decent amount of money. And we like to look at these numbers sometimes in adult ed because we're saying to our students, come in and further your education, and that's going to be a pathway to a better job. And these are the jobs that are growing. So this is the place to put your energy. But there's a problem with looking at percents, and I'm sure this is not news to anybody here. But when you take even a large percent of a relatively small number, that large percent is still going to yield a fairly small number. So even though wind turbine technicians is growing by 61%, that's the fastest growing field in the economy. It's not a huge amount of jobs, in fact, because there's not a lot of wind turbine technicians. So it doesn't take much to have that grow by 61%. If you look instead at which jobs are growing in terms of actual number of jobs, you can see the top 3 here: home health aides, fast food workers, and cooks. Those are all jobs where the earnings are in the 20s annually. So the top 3 jobs with the most jobs projected for us to have in our economy in the next 10 years are very low paying jobs. And many of our students could be destined to end up in these jobs. We hope that we're preparing our students for college and for jobs where they can make more money, but a certain number of them are going to be in jobs like this. And so one thing we need to be aware of is where there is actual job growth and whether it actually pays a living wage or not. These statistics don't tell us anything about race. Once we put race into the mix, we find that in this chart anyway, we see that Black New Yorkers earn less than white New Yorkers in most industries. So I know it's a little fuzzy, but you can kind of see that whether it's beauty salons or the postal service or banking, Black people in those jobs make sometimes less than half of what their white counterparts make. So those wages, those median wages that we showed here, they're not disaggregated by race. So you can assume that people of color in these jobs are making even less than what the median is there. If you take into account gender, you can see that Black women across all levels of education can expect to make 60-something cents on every dollar that a white man makes. That's pretty stark reality, that even a Black woman with a master's degree can expect to make $56,000 a year, and a white man with the same degree could expect to make $30,000 more than that. So, this is especially troubling at the lower levels because a white man with no high school degree can still make a living wage, but a Black woman really can't, according to the statistics. Obviously, many Black women can and do, but when you look at the overall picture. So those were all about income. Let's look at wealth. If you look at the racial wealth inequality, you can see that it's dramatic in this country. It's even more dramatic than income. So wealth is your assets minus your debts. And for decades, the decades shown here from 1983 and then projected forward to 2024, it's just a huge racial wealth gap. And it's getting worse as time goes on. So a really important part of the economic reality that our students face. And then, when you compound this dramatically inequitable economic situation with health disparities and with a pandemic, you can see that, the level of suffering is just multiplied. And this is partly due to, it's due to many things, health disparities by race, but it also, as we already talked about, has to do with, who are the essential workers? Who are the people that had to show up at work? Who are the people that had to keep doing two jobs, two dangerous jobs, despite the pandemic? So a really important part of the picture here is that the pandemic has really, while it has made the rich richer, it has slammed the people who already were struggling to make ends meet, partly because family members have died and so they've lost income earners, and also because there's been so much sickness and lack of paid time off, and just absorbing a huge amount of trauma in these communities. So how does this connect back to addressing racial inequity in our classrooms? I'm kind of thinking about the person who asked the question about, this is a lot about systemic racism. And how does that connect to looking at bias and looking at how inequity shows up in our classrooms? So what do people think? Why should we pay attention in the field of adult ed? Why should we pay attention to that kind of macroeconomic data? So Jessica says WIOA. And what do you mean about that, Jessica? What's the relationship between WIOA and the data that I just shared? And Susan says, what are the real hopes of our students? Yeah, sometimes, this can be depressing, right? It's like, wow, I've shared this before in workshops, and people say, I don't want to share this with my students. It's too depressing. So it does raise that question. It's so depressing out there. Should we just ignore this? Should we just pretend like it's not happening? Should we keep sort of playing the lottery and hoping that, that handful of students that we can kind of support to really reach their goals, that's good enough? And I guess what I'm saying is that, no, it's not good enough. We have to think about everybody, and we have to think about what the reality is that our students face when they go into the work world. And we have to equip them with the skills that they might be able to use to change that, to make it different. And we also have to do that work ourselves. Elizabeth says, yeah, we have to know the realities in order to advocate for change. Yeah, where do we put our attention? If we don't have this information, we don't know where to put our attention. And there's a temptation perhaps to kind of keep putting our attention on the things that are right before us, our own behaviors, or, the behaviors of our program. And those are very important to do. But there's this larger piece that continues to be what I call the water we swim in, that if we don't address it, it just continues to be, the water and it continues to impact us, and it continues to get in our way. So I see Mark saying, wow, to Moira's question, but I didn't see Moira's question. So help me out.
Moira asked, we're advising students about careers/jobs. Are we advising them based on our own ideas and biases?
Right. Mm-hmm. And if our own ideas don't include this larger reality, then we're not going to be able to advise them well. There's a great mythology in American culture, which is that everybody can just pick themselves up by their bootstraps. But clearly that's literally physically impossible. And also, it's not true. There is a large class and groups and demographics of people that are going to be doing those low-wage jobs. And are we just going to pretend like that's not true? Or are we going to perhaps consider the skills that they might need to not leave that behind, but go in there and make those bad jobs better jobs? That, I think, is part of the challenge before us. And change the nature of work, or change what work looks like. What about that? Is it fair that certain groups of people are all the farm workers and certain other people are the managers of those farm workers? Is that the world we want to live in? Is that how we want it to be? Or is that something that we could set our mind to changing? So a big challenge, definitely, and not one that is easy to take on, but one that we could definitely start to think about. And I shouldn't say start to think about, because there's many, many people in adult education in our field who are already thinking about it and doing a beautiful job. And I'm gonna talk about some of those examples coming up. But so here's just two thoughts from me about why looking at this data matters and how it can affect our teaching. For one thing, the language that we use when we talk about getting ready for jobs and careers, it sounds race neutral, but working in the US is profoundly not race neutral. So there's all sorts of hidden bias in that concept that it's a one size fits all. We're just going to get everybody ready for jobs and careers by creating these standards and then having people teach to these standards and equipping students with these skills, which will make them ready for jobs and careers. In fact, it's a dramatically different landscape for people, depending on race in part, and also many other things, which we're not talking, we're focusing on race here. It's a dramatically different landscape based on race. And so maybe there's other things other components that need to come into that mix when we're talking about getting ready for jobs and careers. Also, I think looking at this larger picture helps us think twice about the deficit model. And, as much as we don't want to fall into that model where we see our students as the sum of their deficits, you come in, you take your pre-test, we see where you need work, and then we're going to patch that up. We're going to fill those gaps, patch you up, get you ready to go. Here you are presenting with X, Y, and Z deficits. We'll address those, then you'll be fine. And actually, what we're seeing here is what's wrong is really the inequities with the way our work world is set up, and with the way inequality is allowed to thrive and be rampant, and with the way that inequality is allowed to be so thoroughly defined by race. These are the things that are wrong, and these are the things that need to be fixed. And so, yes, in the adult ed classroom, we set goals, we notice where people need to work, and we do that. But we need to really be able to zoom out and see the larger picture and see that it's really our students that are not the problem. Our students have a lot of skills, a lot of abilities, and they could do great, except that they're facing so much oppression, so much systemic injustice. And so thinking about how to address that could be part of what we do in adult ed. Okay.
Yeah. And to that point, Cynthia, Elizabeth wrote that advising for work and career also means for learning about workers' rights, how to unionize, advocate, fight for better conditions.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm gonna say a little bit more about that later in the webinar, but I'm glad it came up here. Okay. So let's take another stab at surfacing an underlying perspective. This one is about financial literacy. So here is the challenge. Students say they have money problems. As their teacher, you search for financial literacy resources to help them make sense of and address the challenges they face. You find one source that offers workshops such as tips for managing your money, how to make informed retirement decisions, use Google spreadsheets to make a budget, 3 strategies for saving for college. So now I turn to you, participants in the webinar here. Carrie says, LOL, these are useless. Why are they useless? Are you kidding? This is how we do financial literacy. It's all about, private money management. Oh, Pesha says you can't manage your way out of poverty. And then Lisa says, yeah, we have money to save. Remember the slide about racial inequities in wealth? Some people have no wealth to manage, or they don't make enough to have savings to manage. And then Carrie says it doesn't address how their resources. Oh, I missed it. It went away. Sorry. Yes, it's all based on assumptions. So what is this, the assumption though? What is the assumption of this kind of financial literacy? Keep in mind, this is how we do financial literacy over and over and over again. This is what you see. And it's not that it doesn't matter. It does matter. I mean, you know, we all need to learn how to do these things. You know, even if we make a small amount of money, we still need to think about, you know, how we're going to manage it. So, and we still might want to use Google spreadsheets to make a budget. So it's not that this is totally worthless, but what's wrong with, what's the implicit bias here? What's the underlying perspective in this? Okay, I see lots of things coming up in the chat. And what does NGPF mean? Somebody put that in the chat. Yeah. So what is, I'm still trying to get to, oh, next generation personal finance, that's NGPF, thank you. It assumes that college is the future. It assumes that people have wealth to manage. Assumes people are choosing to be poor rather than addressing systemic issues that put and keep people in poverty. Assumes that retirement is an option. Assumes that learners don't have financial literacy. True, all true. These are all assumptions that are written in there. Yeah. So, yeah, assumes that, thank you. Somebody said it assumes that poverty is a choice based on poor decisions. Yeah, and Carrie says these aren't necessarily useless, but they might not necessarily be the priorities. Okay, yeah, there's lots of great comments here. Money is only one kind of resource, says Christina. There's others that we could be thinking about how to manage your resources. To me, what I feel when I see things like that is it implies that your financial literacy is a matter of private money management, as opposed to having a sort of a literacy or an awareness about the larger world and your role in it, and what you might be able to do with others to change that system. I feel like financial literacy looks something like this, like the people in the boat, you know, that the way to manage is to row your boat better. And that what you're in is you're in these high seas, you're at risk of hitting this rocky shore. And if you just navigate your own personal boat really masterfully, you'll stay afloat, you'll stay upright, you won't take on water, you won't run into that rocky shore, and you'll be okay. You know, you'll be okay, just kind of on your own. Rather than, and then also the environment is nature. It's, and there's nothing you can do about that. You know, nature isn't man-made. Nature is the seas, you know, it's just going to come at you. The wave's going to come at you, or it's not going to come at you. And it's up to you to navigate the wave as well as you possibly can. And that's just not true. The economy is not part of nature. You know, the way we do jobs and work in this country is not part of nature. These are human-made institutions. They're human-made systems, and humans created them to be the way they are, and humans can make them different if we put our minds to it. We absolutely can do that. So part of financial literacy could be thinking about how to make change. And that's where I want to go with the last, 20 minutes that we have for our webinar. So, right, financial literacy could still include a focus on personal budgets, but it might also not be race neutral. It might acknowledge racial stratification and provide a civics lesson about how to counter it. This would equip our students with tools to make bad jobs better. And that is a profound way to defend Black and brown lives. And it's a profound way to address bias, because you're changing the messages, the inputs that people are getting by changing what work looks like. So here's an example from Massachusetts of how adult ed could partner with other organizations to do something about the inequities at work. And in this case, it's a story of MK, which is our statewide professional organization, allied with a grassroots organization called Raise Up Massachusetts. And we partnered with them to raise the minimum wage, which was something we were fighting for on the ballot, to get on the ballot, and to ensure that Massachusetts workers would have access to paid sick time. And both of these things, we ended up winning. We got an increased minimum wage, and we got paid sick time for employers that are a certain size. And the way this happened is people from the grassroots organizations came to our statewide conference and talked about these struggles and showed people how you go about getting signatures on these petitions to get something onto the ballot. So everybody learned about the whole ballot process in our state. You learned how to go about getting signatures. You learned how to talk to people about why this matters to have it on the ballot. And teachers brought this back to their classrooms, and students got a civics lesson in how to affect something in their state, important policies that have a big impact on them as workers. So this is just one example from the field of people partnering up, adult educators partnering up with grassroots organizations to make a change in their community. There's another really great example out of New York City. The Literacy Assistance Center has launched something called the Literacy and Justice Initiative. And they have a mission to connect students to movements for racial, social, and economic justice. And so this is an opportunity where teachers can bring this idea to their classrooms, connect students with organizations that are advocating for things that are really relevant for students. Students obviously have a choice about how to get involved or whether not to get involved, but there's lots of resources out there in our communities, and collaborating with community organizations, or a collaboration between community organizations and adult ed, is a great opportunity to bring these forces together and to begin to make changes. It also, I think, communicates this message that the way our institutions are set up is not written in stone. You know, it's not the weather, it's not nature, it's something that we can have an impact on, and we can find lots of ways to make a difference there. One of the ways, and I really want to encourage us to think about doing this more in adult ed, is we could talk about unions and the role of unions. Now, unions are not a panacea. They're not perfect. Some unions are corrupt. Some union bureaucrats are not helpful. But overall, unions do a lot to raise wages for people and to secure dignity on the job and to security on the job. So I found this little infographic that shows us that in Miami, there are 3 union hotels, and the average hourly wage of non-union housekeepers in Miami is $9.50. In Boston, there are 29 union hotels, and the average hourly wage of union housekeepers is $21.45. I'm sorry, I don't have the year for this, but it's fairly recent. So what happens, the role of unions isn't just that union housekeepers make more money. It's also that having 29 union hotels in the city of Boston means that the non-union hotels have to drive up their wages to keep their workers. Otherwise, everybody would want to only work at the union hotel. So it has an effect in the whole climate of hotels and housekeepers' wages. So in Boston, the hourly wage for non-union housekeepers is going to be higher because of this impact of the union hotels. So I would make the case that talking about unions in our classroom, creating lesson plans that help people understand the role of unions, teaching the history of the labor movement and what unions have won for workers so far would have a really big impact. Also, reminding our students that a union job is a really good pathway for many people. You know, you're thinking about what kind of work you want to get into. One thing you could kind of take into account is whether there are any union jobs in that field. And how would you go about getting a union job? So integrating that into our classroom, I think, is a really important form of financial literacy. I was reading recently that, you know, there was a struggle in Alabama among Amazon workers to start a union there. And they lost by a kind of a large margin. The union vote was defeated on a scale of 2-1, I think. And in one article that I was reading about that, the workers said, well, I don't even really know what a union is. Like what I don't have enough, they don't know what a union is. They don't know or trust unions. So they're making a decent wage at Amazon. The starting wage in that warehouse was something like $15.30, higher than a lot of other starting wages at Alabama jobs. Why should I, risk that for something that I don't even really know what it is? So being educated about unions, about the labor movement, which brought us the 40-hour work week, the weekend, which helped get rid of child labor, which helps provide job security, pensions, things like that, is a huge part of what we could be teaching. And I have taught in both union and non-union workplaces. I've taught English as a second language in both of those workplaces. And I have to say, it's really different when your students come to class distraught about something that happened to them on the job, and they have a union behind them. Even if the union's not perfect, they have a collective body that they can go to and that will stand up for them. They have a union steward, they have a contract, they have a collective bargaining agreement. They have the power of the union behind them. And the distress that you feel on the job when something bad happens to you is a really different quality when you know that you have an organization backing you to make it right. In a non-union workplace, the way management wants it to be is they want each worker to have to go to HR to talk about whatever their problem is one-on-one. And it's not one-on-one, it's one worker to all of management. And that's the way management wants it. They want you to have to come to them individually. They don't want you to come to them collectively because they know that you're stronger if you're in a union, if you have a whole collective backing you. So having that awareness, having that knowledge, knowing the history of the labor movement, even with all of its imperfections. And in fact, it's probably important to teach those imperfections too, because we don't want to be too idealistic about it. There's going to be problems. There's things that don't work about it. There's things that are off, but it helps and it can make a difference.
Cynthia, can I cut in here?
Yes,
Celia,
please.
there's a comment that I think you should address from Leah.
Okay.
And it's a question. Do we really think that talking about this subject will help the bias racism? How?
How do I think talking about unions?
Right.
Right. Great question. So, interestingly, unions have a racist history, and that's something that we could look into too when we teach about this. And that's something that the labor movement has tried to work on with various degrees of success. But yes, Black workers in union jobs do a lot better than Black workers in non-union jobs. And teaching that and making that reality visible is a really important ingredient for our students to know and for them to have in their awareness. How does it address racism? Racism shows up in work, as we've seen from the statistics that I shared. Unions provide a collective body to fight back against low wages and lack of dignity on the job. So having a union is a way to improve racism at work, because it's a body that can fight for those things. There's other bodies as well. Communities can fight for laws. Communities can fight for higher minimum wage laws. They can fight for paid sick leave policies. They can fight for higher taxes for corporations so that there's a better funded safety net. They can fight for healthcare for all. There's all kinds of things that you can fight for as a community and as a workplace. But I think that because we see so much racism showing up at work, and since one way to fight against injustice at work is to have an organized body of workers to go up against those bad policies, that yeah, unions are a really important part of the solution to addressing racism in this country. I hope that answers your question. I want to, just as a civics thing, remind people, or let you know if you don't already, that there is an important act that was currently just passed by the House and is now up before the Senate. It's called the PRO Act. Protect the Right to Organize is what I think PRO stands for. It's a law that basically makes it easier for people to try to organize a union at their workplace. There are some protections that exist on the laws now, on the books now, but there's also a lot of right to work states, and I should put right to work states in quotes. Those states actually make it much harder to organize a union at a workplace. And you don't have to, this isn't something where I'm saying everybody should be in favor of this act or not. I'm sure you can guess how I feel about it. But if you were going to think about bringing this into your classroom, it's not necessarily that you're bringing it in to say to everybody in your class, we should all support this. No, you want to bring it in as a law that senators are going to be looking at. And what does it mean? And you want to bring in materials that talk about unions and what they are and what this law would change. And you want to generate for your help your students generate their own opinion about it, and perhaps write a letter to their senator about how they feel about it. So even though I'm being quite didactic here in this webinar, it doesn't mean you turn around and go back to your class in a didactic way, but you go back with this content in an open-minded way, knowing that this content is an important feature on the landscape, and we want to invite critical thinking about this content, which is a lot better than having it be invisible content, which is kind of what it is now. So we want to move it from way off on the margins, way outside of people's awareness. We want to put it more in the center so people understand it, know about it, can do their own independent thinking about it, but they can't think about it until it's brought to their awareness and there's a forum for discussing it and thinking about it. Okay, so we just have a few more minutes and I want to start to close by just invoking Ella Baker. I found some great speeches of hers on the internet. I'm sure you can find them too. But in this one, she says to a large crowd of people, she says, a nice gathering like today is not enough. People know Ella Baker. She's a very important and key backbone civil rights activist. She was not as well known as Martin Luther King, but she was an absolute backbone of the civil rights movement and a brilliant organizer and thinker. And she said to this large crowd of adoring fans, who were cheering her on, she said, a nice gathering like today is not enough. We have to go back. We have to work every day of every year. We have to be willing to be part of the struggle. And so I want to use that to just acknowledge all of you who are here today for showing up, for being part of the field of adult education. whether you're teachers or staff or administrators or allies in some way, you obviously are on the front lines. You put in the hard work. This last year has been particularly hard, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the awful assault on Black lives and the movement that has risen up in defense of Black lives. And I appreciate you being here. I appreciate everything that you do. And I hope that, the 3 buckets that I've offered today are helpful for thinking about how to take the work forward. We have 2 more opportunities in this webinar series to dig deeper. On April 20th, looking at classroom materials and practices with Riva, and on April 27th, looking at programs in the field with Carmen Stewart. So I hope you all can be there for that. And I hope you'll check out our interactive space. I'm going to ask Megan to pop that Google Doc link into the chat, and so you can click on it, and you'll see lots of ideas and strategies in there. By no means comprehensive, but if you want to add your own, you have suggesting rights if you have the link. So please do that. Also, there's some handouts for today. What would be an adult education webinar without handouts? These are all from the Change Agent. Don't be too shocked. But I think they're really good materials. And since I talked about all this stuff, I want to leave you with something that you could actually bring into the classroom tomorrow if you feel like it. The first is lesson packet number 10. And this is available to anybody, whether you have a subscription to the Change Agent or not. It's completely free, so that link will work for you. It's called Taking Action at Work, and it's a collection of first-person stories of students speaking up at work. So if you're interested in this idea of bringing in that aspect of the content that I've shared today, then here's some materials that you can use. Also, lesson packet 17 it's from our Indigenous peoples issue, and it's these adaptations that I did for a slightly lower literacy level, just like about level 4. That's a grade level equivalent. It's a really nice 13-page full color collection of 5 articles by and about Indigenous peoples. And then finally, our Talking About Race issue is free for everybody. If you go to our top page and you fill out a form, you'll get a PDF of our Talking About Race issue, all the audio and all the extras that go with that. So I want to leave you with materials that you can take and turn around and just go ahead and try them out. Also, I want to leave you with some resources. Not going to recite what all these are, but we'll send you a copy of these slides. And this is just a lot of great content that you can use to continue thinking about racial equity in our field. And to close, I wanted to bring in the amazing Paulo Freire and his idea that when we read the word, we read the world. We do that in order to change the world, in order to make it the way we want it to be. And so I was hoping that as we close for today, you might want to share a word or 2 about what you're taking with you from this hour and a half together. So if you would like to use the chat and make sure you post it to all panelists and attendees, I would love to hear a word or 2 or a phrase about what you're taking with you. I see Lisa says hope. Thank you. Stronger feeling of peace. Wow, that's really great. I'm so glad. I wanted to leave you with some of the important perspectives and reality that we're dealing with, but also some hope and feeling of inspiration, lots of information to move forward, tools, optimism, great. Change is possible. Yes, lots of specifics. Great. Buoyant, somebody says. That's a good word. Love that word. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to really enjoy looking back over the chat again and seeing what everybody has to say, but it's time to close. So I will officially end our webinar. Hope to see you all on April 20th and April 27th. Thanks again, Megan Morris and Celia, for helping me with the chat. Thanks everybody for being here today and for all the work that you do. Truly appreciate it. Goodbye, everybody.